morning, Westside. Good morning. It is wonderful to be with you this Sunday morning. I've been away in New York City for a bit over a week and missed being with you last Sunday. So it is good to be with you today, to see your smiles, to hear your voices, and to be in the presence of good, kind, compassionate people. Because it is typically good, kind, compassionate people who change the world for the better, who make a positive impact on the world around them. Mean people will certainly have an impact too, but it is not typically the favorable kind of change that helps our community and society progress. It was compassionate people who fought to end slavery. It was compassionate people who continue to fight against bigotry of all types today. It is, I believe, compassionate people who are changing the way they eat and who strive to lessen their impact on the environment. No matter the progressive cause, it is good, kind, compassionate people who lead the way. People like those in this room on Sundays. And whether it is slavery or marriage equality or any number of issues you and I care about, we will always see those who want to conserve the status quo, to keep things the way they are or were, to slow down that arc which bends towards justice. Those who want to maintain the status quo will tell us that if we change slavery, the economy will collapse. They will tell us that if you let these people vote, chaos will ensue. They will tell us that if you let these two men get married or these two women get married, the very institution itself will crumble. They will try to frighten people to the point that they'll retreat from the goodness and kindness and compassion out of fear, out of the belief that we must maintain what we have because those progressives, those liberals, will only get us into trouble. So as I watched the election results come in this past November, I was not paying much attention to what the states of Washington and Colorado did. But as I have thought more about it, it may be that what they did in legalizing marijuana for recreational use to be regulated like alcohol, well, it may have been the beginning of big changes to local and eventually national changes to drug policy in the United States. And while I would not necessarily argue this issue is nearly as important to most of us as the others I've mentioned, there really are some similarities of injustice. And I believe it is also good, kind, compassionate people who have brought and are bringing change when it comes to the existing laws pertaining to the medical and recreational use of marijuana. Now, why would I say that? Why would a minister like me and a licensed therapist with a specialty in chemical dependency counseling speak openly and publicly about marijuana reform being a good thing? And let me say from the get-go that I have not partaken in the smoking of pot or weed in ages. To tell the truth, I wouldn't even know how to go about obtaining marijuana if I wanted to. But I do not believe marijuana is any more dangerous than alcohol. In fact, I am convinced it is less destructive. I would wager the physicians and nurses among us will have seen much more damage from alcohol than from pot. And I believe because of the current legal system, it is easier for young people today to get a bag of weed than it is to obtain alcohol. Now, society has made it fairly easy to pick on people who smoke marijuana. just give you a couple of examples through two jokes I found. I've not changed the words to any of these, and the first one goes like this. A stoner walks into an appliance store and asks the owner, "How much for that TV set in the window?" The owner looks at the TV set, then looks at the stoner and says, "I don't sell stuff to potheads." So the stoner tells the owner that he'll quit smoking pot and will come back the next week to buy the TV. A week later, the stoner comes back and says, "Hey, I quit smoking pot. Now, how much for that TV set in the window?" And the store owner says, "I told you, I don't sell to potheads." So the stoner leaves again. He comes back a week later and says, "How much for that TV?" The owner says, "I'm not going to tell you again. I don't sell to potheads." The giggling stoner looks back at the owner and says, "How can you tell I'm a pothead?" The stoner looks at him and then says, "Well, because that's a microwave." That's kind of funny. But it really doesn't bode well for the second one. Here is the second one that says, a hippie was walking down the street one day when a pixie, a fairy, pounced on him and said, "Today is your lucky day. I'm going to give you 2 wishes. What will be the first one?" So the hippie thinks about this for a moment and says, "I want a never-ending joint." The pixie snaps her fingers, and there's this king-sized joint. The hippie jacks it up and starts puffing, and after 5 hits, the joint is still the same length. Next, the pixie says, "And number 2?" And the hippie replies, "This is so cool, man. Give me another one." See, I told you it didn't bode well. But maybe I need to explain this a little bit. See, when you have one never-ending joint, you don't need a second. I try. I do the best. But society has been changing its attitude towards marijuana use in recent decades. No longer do we see stoners or hippies, but very often we see individuals trying to gain relief from cancer pain or chemotherapy, nausea. We see people alleviating the symptoms of glaucoma or AIDS. We see cannabis being used for all sorts of medical reasons, but we also see society tolerating its use for plain old recreational purposes. Now listen to what this guy says. He says, "I really believe we should treat marijuana the way we treat beverage alcohol. I've never used marijuana," he says, "and I don't intend to. But it's just one of those things that I think this war on drugs just hasn't succeeded." Now, who do you think it was who said that? It was Pat Robertson. Yes, the same Pat Robertson, who is the chairman of the Christian Broadcasting Network and the chancellor of Regent's University, about the most conservative Christian university one can attend. In October of 2011, Gallup released a poll which showed the majority of Americans now support the legalization of marijuana. The number has continued to climb through the years. Liberals and those aged 18 to 29 were most in favor. Those Americans 65 and over were most opposed. In 2010, a Washington Post ABC survey found that 81% of respondents favored medical marijuana, up from 69% in 1997. And back in 2002, a Time CNN poll found that 72% thought the decriminalization of marijuana for small personal amounts to be the right thing to do. Attitudes are changing. It might be interesting for you to know, or for a long time you used to be reminded, what the Unitarian Universalist Association has said about marijuana as a voting body. So here is some of the text from a resolution passed during one of our General Assemblies. It states, "Therefore be it resolved that the General Assembly of the Unitarian Universalist Association urges that all local, state, or provincial and federal laws in the United States and Canada making the growing, sale, trade, and possession of marijuana a criminal offense be immediately repealed. We urge that restrictions on the use of marijuana be made similar to those laws on the use of alcoholic beverages. We urge that any effects of the consumption of marijuana that may be found injurious to the user be handled by the proper psychological and medical care, and not by criminal law. And finally, we urge that amnesty be given to all persons convicted under present laws relating to the growing, sale, trade, possession, and consumption of marijuana, and that charges be dropped against all persons presently under indictment for violation of such laws." That general resolution was passed in 1970. And if you were to think we might have changed our minds as an association, here is some of the text from the 2002 UUA Statement of Conscience. It again urges the United States to establish a legal, regulated, and taxed market for marijuana, to treat marijuana as we treat alcohol, but it goes on to say, "Our Unitarian Universalist history calls us to pursue a more just world. Our faith compels us to hold our leaders accountable for their policies. In calling for alternatives to the war on drugs, we are mindful of its victims. Drug use should be addressed solely as a public health problem, not as a criminal justice issue. Dependence upon any illegal drug or inappropriate use of legal drugs may point to deep unmet human needs. We have a moral obligation to advocate compassionate, harm-reducing policy. We believe that our nations have the imagination and capability to address effectively the complex issues of the demand for drugs, both legal and illegal." Attitudes are changing. We don't just see stoners and hippies. Because 18 states and the District of Columbia now allow for medical marijuana, and 14 of those have decriminalized possessing small amounts for recreational use. 4 more states are very close to doing the same thing, with the possibility of Vermont legalizing pot like Washington and Colorado just did. And yet we see those who say, if we allow the use of marijuana for medical or recreational use, our society will go to pot, so to speak. They'll say crime will be rampant. They'll say that we'll have these hazed out people roaming our streets and endangering our children. Now, they may truly be afraid, but the evidence is quite the reverse. Because we have tried prohibition in this country before. Yet when we prohibit a drug, like we did with alcohol, do you remember what we got in return? There was an increase in organized crime. We got people like Al Capone. We got gangsters. People who would make sure you got the drug you wanted, but drove the traffic underground. And people died from getting their drug of choice because the substance was unregulated. Now, I would never say that marijuana is harmless. I would never encourage the use of marijuana for any age. But I do not believe any drug is harmless. Heroin is not harmless, neither is cocaine, neither is alcohol, neither is caffeine. All drugs have some sort of impact. That is what drugs of any sort are supposed to do. And I'm not saying people cannot get addicted to pot, because they can. But the numbers I read are that about 10% of heavy users can develop a dependency on the plant. Compare that with 15% of alcohol users. 17% of cocaine users, and 32% of cigarette smokers. It would be difficult to convince me that marijuana is as harmful as heroin and more dangerous than cocaine as the Drug Enforcement Administration now has it classified or scheduled. Because human beings have been trying to escape from reality for thousands of years, whether for just a little while for some or for some others most of their lives. I read recently there are anthropologists who believe before we even had communities, we had the desire to get high after discovering fermented fruit. People will have their mechanisms to escape. But here's the thing, and this is where good, kind, compassionate people get concerned. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. We put more people in prison than any other country. We have only 5% of the world's population, while at the same time having almost 25% of the world's inmates. With almost 2.5 million prisoners, costing about $24,000 per year and about $5 billion in new prison construction, over $60 billion is used in budget expenditures. This, my friends, is big business. And those prisons must be filled almost to capacity in order to realize a profit. I read this excerpt from the annual report of the Corrections Corporation of America in the latest issue of the Humanist magazine, a periodical I know some Westsiders receive. It says, the demand for our facilities could be adversely affected by the relaxations of enforcement efforts, leniency in convictions and sentencing practices, or through the decriminalization of certain activities that are currently proscribed by our criminal laws. For instance, any changes with respect to drugs and controlled substances or illegal immigration could affect the number of persons arrested, convicted, and sentenced, thereby potentially reducing demand for correctional facilities to house them. These are the people who run many of our prisons. They do not want the prohibition of marijuana to end because it's bad for business. Because who do you think has more lobbying power? A multi-billion-dollar industry? Or the African-American male busted for a couple of ounces of recreational marijuana? Getting tough on crime, 3 strikes and you're out, creates a situation where the have-nots are the ones who are continually punished. If you want to read a good book about this situation, try The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, written by Michelle Alexander, a civil rights lawyer and scholar. The Unitarian Universalist Association recommends a common read each year among its members. You may have seen this mentioned in the UU World magazine, which members receive. The New Jim Crow is this year's common read. And Michelle Alexander was a prominent speaker at last summer's General Assembly. But do you know what other organizations go into financial woes if we stop arresting people, particularly young people, for even the smallest amounts of marijuana? It is the drug rehab facilities. If you are caught with cannabis and are given the choice of jail time or rehab, which one will you likely choose? Even police forces understand they will not be able to hire additional officers when unable to use the war on drugs as a rationale. So today, there is an organization called LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, which brings to light what many officers know to be true with regard to recreational marijuana users. They are not the violent offenders so often portrayed by the government or the media. But it does make you wonder, makes me wonder about those times when I've been so invested in being right that I cannot change my mind. And that's also where I think our government is right now with this war on drugs. A war that we continue to fight since Richard Nixon declared it in 1971, and which prohibition has attempted to curtail since Franklin Roosevelt signed the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, before which consumption was basically legal. We continue to fight another war that we cannot win. And I believe this is why good, kind, compassionate people are changing their minds about marijuana. They see the injustice created by a system that penalizes the person trying to get relief from cancer or who is bothering no one by lighting up on a weekend. And yet we will still see the same kind of fearful response from some. But I say, be not afraid. In fact, if you're moved to examine these issues further, I'd like to recommend NORML, the National Organization to Reform Marijuana Laws, and another called the Marijuana Policy Project. I'm now a member of both, because I do believe that what is happening today is criminal. But I do not believe it is those who've smoked a little grass any more than the person who enjoys a glass of wine after a hard day of work. No, it's not those folks. It is our system itself which is acting criminally. As we rise together in body or spirit and join in our closing hymn number 175, we celebrate the web of life. We'll sing all